Chapter 7 talks about evidence from crime scenes and experiments and how they're used in court. Real evidence is evidence that's perceived by one of the five senses and is often called physical evidence. In order to be admitted in court, it has to be marked, and we have to have a lay witness lay the foundation for it. Marking evidence is showing the evidence to the opposing counsel, assigning it a number, which is usually done by the clerk, and then a witness is called to lay the foundation, and then a motion is made to admit the evidence. Laying a foundation is how we establish how the evidence relates to the case and how the witness relates to the evidence. Regarding crime scene evidence, all evidence admitted has to first be authenticated. It must be gathered, sorted, stored, tested, and presented in court. When processing the crime scene, police have to identify the object and testify as to where it was discovered. They have to record its precise location and storage. When packaging evidence, police have to keep the evidence from being contaminated, and they must keep the chain of custody pristine to ensure it has not been tampered with. Here you can see a typical police sketch of a homicide crime scene. And for those of you that have already taken CJ 215, Principles of Investigation, you've seen an example like this, right? Of the sketch that's drawn to scale, telling you where the person was, the other objects in the room. Scientific evidence is generally tested. So typically the police are going to make comparisons with the scientific evidence, the evidence that's obtained at the crime scene, and compare it with samples from the defendant. And the most common examples would be fingerprints and blood samples. There are limits on samples. Absent an arrest, we usually need a court order to obtain a sample from the defendant, and this would require a search warrant. The more intrusive a test is, the more likely it is to require a warrant. Cases that use scientific evidence provide greater certainty to the trier of fact and result in more convictions. Jurors have typically come to expect scientific evidence in cases now. If guilty, it typically results in a longer sentence as well. When laying the foundation, there's three critical questions here. Is the process a valid scientific test? Was accurate equipment used? And did qualified experts perform the test in the proper manner? And then the judge needs to approve it in order to allow it to be admitted. So recently, some prosecutors have complained that juries now expect scientific evidence, and this is referred to as the CSI effect. Tests can be denied admission for different reasons. If you could provide evidence that showed the equipment used in the test was improper or in a poor state of repair, or show evidence of human error in preparation, performance, or evaluation of the test. And this has happened in Massachusetts recently with, I think, 20 some odd thousand cases being thrown out because of Annie Dugan. And we'll talk about that in class. There's evidence, as I mentioned, of human error in preparation, or you can show that the test itself is unreliable, that it has false positives or false negatives. Some commonly accepted scientific tests are fingerprints. They're first used in New York courts in 1901, and the FBI created the first national database in 1924. Although, interestingly enough, this has recently come into question. Under President Obama, President Obama had a committee that advised him on scientific issues. And they advised that a lot of things that have been allowed in court have not actually been properly verified empirically. There's three key principles related to fingerprints. All individuals have unique fingerprints, they do not change, and they have unique patterns that allow us to classify them. Latent prints are prints that are recovered from a surface. Here you could see some examples of different types of fingerprint characteristics. Arches, a whorl. Probably one of the easiest ways for you to look at your fingerprints is to either, I see some right now all over my computer screen, or to put your finger on your cell phone and then look at it that way. You could certainly put it in ink and do this as well, but you can kind of look at it pretty well on your cell phone screen. Fingerprints are matched depending on how many points between the samples are identical. And most departments use experts, but recent tests have questioned how good humans are at matching prints. Other commonly accepted tests include blood alcohol levels, and these are typically used in DUI cases. Alcohol is absorbed into the blood at varying rates, and the most common sampling technique is through a breathalyzer. The typical level of intoxication is 0.08% blood alcohol level. Blood typing is also commonly accepted. Police first have to determine if the substance in question is blood, and then we test for A, B, O, or AB type blood and whether it's positive or negative. The alternative is based on the Rh factor, and there's a second alternative based on the MN system. DNA testing is commonly accepted. All humans have DNA in each bodily cell, and tests vary as to how complex and expensive they are. The first practical DNA tests were created in 1985. Today, there's 5 common types of DNA tests: restrictive fragmentation length polymorphism, RFLP. This is an older test and requires a large sample. Short tandem repeat is a newer test that can use small samples. Mitochondrial DNA uses non-nucleus samples, and it can be used to show a maternal link. Y chromosome analysis can be used to look at paternal links. And familial DNA. You can develop here a likelihood ratio that shows the possibility that a relative of the party did or did not commit the crime. We also have identification of controlled substances. Samples are screened to provide a general type, like this is an opiate or it's a cannabinoid. And then police use representative samples for more detailed tests to distinguish the type of opiate or source. Common tests include infrared spectrophotometry, spot tests, and microscopic tests. Identifications of firearms are also commonly accepted scientific tests. A firearm examiner is often called a ballistics expert, and they engage in comparisons of bullets and firearms, and this started in 1906. It was widely accepted by the 1930s. There can be problems, though, depending on the condition of the recovered bullet or firearm, and typically tests focus on the lands and grooves. Forensic anthropology is the identification of humans and their remains. It's used to estimate factors like age and gender and can reconstruct faces from skeletal remains. Age progression is used to age child photos to assist in current searches and identification. And geographic profiling is when the police use the location of one crime to link it to another or to a suspect. And it's common for serial killers and serial rapists. Forensic footwear analysis is when scientists use footprints to show height, weight, and impairments. Digital image processing allows for improving picture qualities and is most often used to reconstruct income and expenses. Oh, sorry, I skipped ahead. Forensic accounting is used in fraud and embezzlement cases and can be used to reconstruct income and expenses. Specialists can recover lost data using computer and digital forensics, and these are often performed by certified forensic computer experts. Tests that are not commonly accepted: polygraphs. This is an attempt to detect deception based on skin, heart, and breath rates. The skill of the operator is critical to results, and the results are often inconclusive. Hypnotically refreshed testimony is often also problematic because it is subject to suggestion and is generally not accepted in court. U.S. v. Sheffer. The Supreme Court heard a case about the scientific reliability of polygraphs in 1998. The defendant was seeking to admit it in a military trial, and under military law, they are per se inadmissible. The defendant claimed that this violated the Constitution, and the Supreme Court ruled it is up to individual states to establish validity of polygraph, and that the defendant's trial was not unconstitutional. Most police departments use polygraphs in hiring new employees, but they're not admissible in court cases as they're generally too inaccurate. They don't meet that Fry or Doe-Bear standard. Now, what about experiments? An ideal experiment should eliminate all possible variables. And then we test, then change one variable and measure the results. Some basic concepts here for experiments. Valid experiments need similar circumstances repeated for each test. The test has to have a basis in sound science and must conform to established standards. Kumho Tire Company v. Carmichael is a case from 1999, and it concerned the failure of a tire. Kumho challenged the testimony of the expert called by Carmichael. The The trial court banned the testimony and used the Doe-Bear case, applying it to all testimony. The Supreme Court affirmed the trial judge as a gatekeeper of both scientific and other specialized knowledge, which essentially banned ipse dixit statements based only by experts as to cause. So how do we admit experiments? Well, first, in the introduction, we're going to call the party who performed the experiment, lay a proper foundation, and then ask the witness to report on the results. For the foundation, the expert must be familiar with the facts, have knowledge of the equipment, compare those facts with results, and then the judge must accept that it's an accurate test. Common admissions include things like time of death and the speed of cars. And that wraps up Chapter 7, Crime Scene Evidence and Experiments.